The sledgehammer hit the rotting barn wall with a satisfying crack, sending splinters of weathered wood flying across the Millfield farm. Jake Morrison, the demolition foreman, had torn down hundreds of old structures, but something felt different about this one. The elderly Hartwell couple had lived here for 60 years, keeping to themselves, never bothering anyone. Now, 3 days after their funeral, their property was being cleared for development. When the wall gave way completely, Jake's flashlight beam cut through the darkness and landed on something impossible. Chrome bumpers gleamed back at him. Pristine paint jobs. Not one car, but 12 vintage automobiles lined up like soldiers. Ferraris, Porsches, a 1967 Shelby Cobra that should have been worth more than the entire farm. Jake had spent 2 tours in Afghanistan and thought he'd seen everything. But these weren't just any classic cars. He recognized them from the FBI's most wanted list he'd memorized during his police academy days 15 years ago. These were the vehicles stolen from the Monterey Classic Car Show in 1987, the heist that disappeared $43 million worth of automotive history without a trace. What had the quiet Hartwells really been hiding all these years? Holy mother of... Tommy Rodriguez, Jake's demolition partner, appeared beside him, nearly dropping his crowbar. "Boss, are those real?" Jake stepped into the hidden garage, his boots echoing on the concrete floor. The space was immaculate, climate-controlled, with not a speck of dust on any surface. Someone had been maintaining these cars religiously. The familiar scent of leather and chrome polish filled his nostrils as he approached the nearest vehicle. A midnight blue Ferrari 250 GTO. "Don't touch anything," Jake commanded, his military training kicking in. "We need to call this in." Tommy was already pulling out his phone, fingers flying over the screen. "My cousin works at the sheriff's department. Should I?" "No." Jake's voice cut through the air like a blade. Something made him pause. In his peripheral vision, he caught movement through the garage's only window, a grimy pane that faced the main road. A black sedan had slowed to a crawl outside the property, tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun. The car sat there for 30 seconds that felt like hours before accelerating away. Jake's combat instincts screamed warning. Someone had been watching, someone who knew exactly what they'd just discovered. "Change of plans," he said, grabbing Tommy's phone and ending the call before it connected. "We need to think this through." "What? Why?" Tommy's eyes darted between Jake and the cars. "Dude, these things are worth millions. We gotta..." The Hartwell heist was the biggest unsolved auto theft in American history, Jake interrupted, his mind racing. 36 years ago, professional thieves walked into the Monterey show during a charity gala. 17 minutes. That's all it took to vanish with 12 cars and leave no trace. No fingerprints, no witnesses who could identify anyone. No security footage worth a damn. He moved deeper into the garage, noting details with the methodical precision of his former police training. Tool cabinets lined the walls, filled with specialized automotive equipment. A logbook sat open on a workbench, entries dated just last week in shaky handwriting, oil changes, tire rotations, battery maintenance. Harold and Ethel Hartwell hadn't just been hiding stolen cars. They'd been caring for them like beloved children. "The FBI put together a task force," Jake continued, running his flashlight along the wall. "Followed every lead for 20 years. The theory was always that it was an inside job, someone with access to the show, knowledge of security protocols, connections to move the cars overseas." His beam caught something that made his blood run cold. Photographs, dozens of them, tacked to a corkboard behind the workbench. Pictures of the cars at the original show, newspaper clippings about the heist, and what looked like surveillance photos of various people taken over the years. In the center of the board was a photo that stopped Jake's heart. It showed Harold Hartwell, but not the elderly farmer Jake remembered seeing around town. This was Harold at maybe 35, wearing a security uniform, standing next to the same midnight blue Ferrari now parked in front of them. Harold Hartwell had worked security at the Monterey Classic Car Show. "Tommy," Jake said slowly, "how many people knew we were tearing down this barn today?" "I don't know. You, me, The county office. Whoever hired us. Tommy's voice trailed off as the implications hit him. The property management company put out bids. Could be dozens of people knew the timeline. Jake's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering. Morrison. A voice like sandpaper spoke carefully. Walk away from the barn, Mr. Morrison. Take your friend and your equipment and leave. File a report that you found structural damage requiring specialized removal. Come back tomorrow. The line went dead. In the silence that followed, Jake heard Tommy's breathing quicken and the distant sound of another vehicle approaching on the gravel road outside. They weren't alone anymore. The first thing Detective Sarah Chen noticed about the Kellerman farm was how quiet it felt, even with a dozen people trampling around the property. Not the peaceful quiet of rural life, but something heavier, like the silence that follows a gunshot. She ducked under the yellow tape and approached the barn, where crime scene unit photographer Marcus Webb was already documenting everything with methodical precision. The demolition crew stood clustered near their equipment, looking like kids who'd accidentally broken something valuable. "What do we have, Marcus?" Sarah asked, pulling on latex gloves. 12 vehicles total, all vintage, ranging from 1920s to 1950s. Every single one is pristine. I'm talking showroom condition. He gestured toward the excavated garage. But here's the kicker. I ran the plates on 3 of them already. Sarah raised an eyebrow. And? Reported stolen. Different heists, different decades. Marcus handed her his preliminary notes. That Duesenberg disappeared from a Chicago collector in 1952. The Packard was lifted from a Detroit auto show in 1948. Sarah descended the wooden ramp into the underground space, her flashlight beam dancing across chrome bumpers and leather interiors that looked like they'd been preserved in amber. The air smelled of motor oil and something else, something organic and unpleasant that made her nose wrinkle. "There's more," Marcus called from above. "Found this wedged behind the Cadillac's rear tire." He tossed down an evidence bag containing what looked like a business card, yellowed with age. Sarah squinted at it through the plastic. Meridian Insurance Company, established 1923. She looked up. They still around? Defunct since 1971. But I'm betting they wrote policies on some of these cars. Sarah continued her circuit of the garage, noting details. The concrete floor was stained with decades-old oil, but she could make out tire tracks leading to each parking space. Someone had been very organized about this operation. Professional. Her radio crackled. "Detective Chen, this is dispatch. You requested background on Harold and Meredith Kellerman? Go ahead." Both deceased as of 18 months ago. Harold died of a heart attack. Meredith followed 6 weeks later. Natural causes. Attending physician was Dr. Elizabeth Carver. Property went to the county after no relatives came forward. Sarah frowned. In her experience, everybody had relatives. They might be estranged, they might be broke, but they usually surfaced when real estate was involved. What about neighbors? Anyone who knew them? Still checking. Property's been empty since they died. County was planning to auction it when the demolition company put in a bid to clear it for development. She thanked dispatch and climbed back up to ground level, where the demolition foreman was pacing near his bulldozer. Tom Bradley, according to her notes. 40-something, work-weathered hands, nervous energy. "Mr. Bradley, tell me exactly what happened this morning." "Like I told the first officer, we were breaking through the barn floor around 7 a.m. Hit something solid about 3 feet down. Figured it was an old foundation, maybe a root cellar." He wiped his palms on his jeans. "When we cleared the dirt away, found those wooden doors. Thought maybe we'd struck some kind of antique gold mine, you know? People pay good money for old farm equipment." "Who else was here when you made the discovery?" "My crew. 3 guys, Danny Martinez, Pete Collins, and my nephew Jake, plus the county inspector, Lisa Park. She was here to sign off on the demolition permit." Sarah made notes. "Any of them seem particularly interested in what you found?" Bradley's expression shifted slightly. "Well, Pete knows cars. He was pretty excited, kept talking about how much these things might be worth. But hell, we all were curious. Where's Pete now? Said he had to take care of something. Left maybe an hour ago, right after you guys showed up. Bradley paused. That normal? Sarah's instincts prickled. In her experience, innocent people stuck around crime scenes, fascinated by the drama. Guilty people found reasons to leave. I'll need his contact information. While Bradley looked up Pete Collins in his phone, Sarah walked the perimeter of the property. The Kellerman farmhouse sat about 50 yards from the barn, windows boarded up, paint peeling like old skin. If the couple had known about the cars, they'd kept quiet about it for decades. Her phone buzzed with a text from her partner, Detective Ray Morrison, who was back at the station running the vehicle identification numbers through national databases. 3 more matches, all reported stolen between 1945 and 1953. This is big, Sarah, really big. Sarah stared at the barn, trying to imagine Harold and Meredith Kellerman as criminal masterminds. It didn't fit. Elderly farmers didn't typically run sophisticated auto theft rings, which meant someone else had been using their property either with or without their knowledge. The question was whether that someone was still alive, still watching, still invested in keeping this secret buried under 3 feet of Iowa soil. The morning air carried the scent of turned earth and diesel fuel as Detective Sarah Chen stepped out of her unmarked sedan. The Hartwell farm stretched before her, a patchwork of overgrown fields bordered by weathered fence posts that leaned like tired sentinels. She'd driven the winding country roads for 40 minutes, leaving behind the familiar chaos of downtown for this pocket of rural silence that felt untouched by time. The barn dominated the landscape. Its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze, creating a perimeter around what had been, until yesterday, just another demolition job. Now it was potentially the biggest case of her career. Detective Chen, a uniformed officer, approached, consulting his notepad. Officer Martinez, I was first on scene yesterday after the foreman called it in. Sarah nodded, pulling on latex gloves. Walk me through it. Martinez gestured toward the barn. Demolition crew was taking down the structure when they noticed the floor was hollow in one section. Thought it might be an old root cellar or storm shelter. When they broke through, they found stairs leading to a concrete chamber about 20 feet down. They walked toward the barn's gaping entrance. Inside, the morning light revealed a jagged hole in the wooden floor where the demolition crew had broken through. A ladder descended into darkness below. 7 vehicles total, Martinez continued, all classics from the looks of them. Pristine condition, like they were driven down there yesterday. But here's the thing, the chamber's been sealed tight, no way in or out except through that floor. Sarah peered into the hole, catching the gleam of chrome and polished metal below. Any identification on the vehicles yet? That's where it gets interesting. Martinez flipped a page in his notepad. I ran a few of the license plates through the system before you arrived. 2 of them came back flagged in a federal database, above my clearance level. A chill that had nothing to do with the morning air ran down Sarah's spine. Federal flags meant this was bigger than a simple case of stolen cars. Much bigger. Where are the property owners now? Harold and Marge Hartwell, ages 78 and 76 respectively. They're at County General. Harold had chest pains when the news crew showed up this morning. Marge went with him in the ambulance. Sarah frowned. News crew? How did they find out so fast? Martinez shrugged. Small town, word travels. Channel 7 was here at dawn, wanting to do a story about buried treasure found on local farm. I sent them packing, but you know how it is. Sarah did know. Media attention was the last thing they needed if this was connected to federal crimes. She made a mental note to call the station and request they hold off on the story pending investigation. I need to see the vehicles myself. Did anyone else go down there besides the demolition crew? Just me and Detective Rodriguez from the county sheriff's office. We documented everything with photos and video before sealing it back up. The demolition crew, 4 guys, they're all local. Been running background checks this morning. Sarah descended the ladder carefully. her flashlight beam dancing across the concrete walls of the underground chamber. The space was larger than she'd expected, roughly the size of a warehouse bay. But it was the cars themselves that took her breath away. 7 automobiles sat arranged in perfect formation, each one a masterpiece of automotive history. A midnight blue Jaguar E-Type, a pristine Shelby Cobra in racing stripes, a cherry red Ferrari 250 GT. Even in the artificial light, she could see these weren't ordinary collector cars. They were museum pieces, each worth more than most people's houses. But it was the dust patterns that caught her detective's eye. Or rather, the lack of them. The cars were clean, too clean for having sat in an underground chamber for any significant time. Someone had been maintaining them. Sarah walked between the vehicles, noting details. No spider webs on the mirrors, no corrosion on the chrome. The tires were properly inflated. She knelt beside the Jaguar and touched the ground beneath the engine. No oil stains, no fluid leaks. Her radio crackled. "Detective Chen, this is dispatch. We've got a priority call for you." Sarah keyed her radio. "Go ahead. FBI agent Rebecca Torres is en route to your location. ETA 15 minutes. She says it's regarding the vehicle recovery case." Sarah's stomach tightened. FBI involvement confirmed her suspicions. This wasn't just about stolen cars. She took one final look around the chamber, memorizing every detail. Whatever crime these vehicles represented, it was significant enough to bring federal agents running. As she climbed back up the ladder, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. The cars were too well maintained, the discovery too convenient, and somewhere out there, someone was probably very unhappy that their secret had been exposed. The game, whatever it was, had just begun. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at the Hartwell farm just as the coroner's van was pulling away, its red taillights disappearing into the grey October morning. She'd driven the 43 miles from the county seat, with her coffee growing cold and her mind racing through the preliminary report. Elderly couple, apparent murder-suicide. Hidden cache of vintage automobiles worth millions. It read like something out of a crime novel. Sheriff Tom Brennan met her at the yellow tape, his weathered face grim beneath his wide-brimmed hat. "Hell of a thing, detective. Been sheriff here 22 years, never seen anything like it." Sarah ducked under the tape, pulling her dark hair back into a ponytail. At 34, she was young for a detective, but her sharp instincts and methodical approach had earned respect across 3 counties. "What's your read on the scene?" "That's just it. Something doesn't sit right." Brennan led her toward the farmhouse, a modest 2-story structure with peeling white paint and a wraparound porch. Frank Hartwell supposedly shot his wife Margaret in their bedroom around midnight, then turned the gun on himself. But I knew Frank. Man couldn't hurt a fly. Hell, he cried when he had to put down a sick calf last spring. They paused at the front steps, where evidence markers dotted the ground like yellow flowers. No signs of forced entry? None. But here's what's got me puzzled. Brennan pulled out his notebook, pages fluttering in the crisp breeze. Demolition crew found that car collection yesterday morning. Word spreads fast in a town this size. By afternoon, half the county knew about it. Now, less than 24 hours later, the Hartwells are dead. Sarah's pulse quickened. "You think someone wanted them silenced?" "I'm starting to wonder." They climbed the porch steps, boards creaking under their weight. Demolition foreman, guy named Rick Santos. He's been asking questions, says something spooked him about the whole setup down there. Inside the house, the crime scene told a story that Sarah's trained eye began to dissect immediately. The living room showed no signs of struggle. Family photos lined the mantel, and Margaret's knitting sat neatly in a basket beside her rocking chair. But subtle details nagged at her. A coffee cup on the kitchen counter, still bearing lipstick marks. Margaret's reading glasses, carefully folded on the dining table beside an unfinished crossword puzzle. "These look like people who were planning to wake up this morning," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to Brennan. In the bedroom, she studied the chalk outlines where the bodies had been found. Frank Hartwell on the bed, the .38 revolver, his own, according to registration records, in his right hand. Margaret on the floor beside the dresser, a single gunshot wound to the chest. Ballistics will confirm, but it looks like the same weapon for both shots, Brennan said. No defensive wounds on either victim. Sarah knelt beside the dresser, examining scuff marks on the hardwood floor. Something bothered her about the angles, the way Margaret had fallen. She pulled out her phone and snapped several photos, making mental notes to request the full forensic report. I want to see this garage everyone's talking about. The hidden space beneath the barn took Sarah's breath away. Even with several cars already removed for investigation, the remaining vehicles gleamed under the harsh work lights like sleeping giants. A midnight blue Jaguar E-Type, a cherry red Ferrari 250 GT, a silver Mercedes-Benz 300 SL with distinctive gull-wing doors. Jesus, she whispered, this isn't just a collection. This is a museum. Rick Santos approached from the far end of the garage, his hard hat tucked under his arm. The demolition foreman looked like he hadn't slept, dark circles under his eyes and sawdust still clinging to his flannel shirt. Detective Chen, sheriff said you might want to talk to me. Tell me about yesterday. Everything you remember. Santos ran a hand through his graying hair. We were just doing our job, you know. Tear down the old barn, clear the lot for the new shopping center. Soon as we broke through that false wall, we knew we'd stumbled onto something big. He gestured toward the cars. But it was more than that. The whole setup felt deliberate, like someone had been planning for this day for decades. What do you mean? The ventilation system, climate control. Hell, there's a full mechanical bay back there with tools worth more than my house. This wasn't just storage, this was preservation. Like someone was keeping these cars perfect for a reason. Sarah walked deeper into the garage, her footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. In the corner, she noticed something the other investigators had missed, a small desk with neat stacks of papers weighted down by a vintage spark plug. The top sheet was a hand-drawn map of the garage layout, with each car's position carefully marked. But it was the notation in the corner that made her blood run cold, a date from 37 years ago. And beside it, 3 words in Margaret Hartwell's careful script. Insurance will cover. The morning fog clung to the Blackwood property like a guilty conscience as Detective Sarah Chen pulled her sedan down the gravel drive. She'd been turning the case over in her mind since yesterday's discovery, and something about the whole situation felt orchestrated, too clean, too convenient. Margaret Blackwood stood on the porch, her weathered hands wrapped around a steaming mug. At 73, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned not to waste energy on unnecessary gestures. Her husband, Frank, emerged from the kitchen behind her, his flannel shirt wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. Mrs. Blackwood, Sarah said, climbing the wooden steps. I hope you don't mind me stopping by early. I have a few more questions about the cars. Margaret's pale blue eyes studied Sarah's face. Questions we can't answer, I'm afraid. We've told you everything we know. Sometimes people remember things differently when they've had time to process. Sarah pulled out her notebook, though she could recite the Blackwood story by heart. The barn's been in your family how long? Since 1952, Frank said, settling into a rocking chair that groaned under his weight. Built it myself that summer after we married. Used it for equipment storage, hay in the early years. And you never noticed the garage underneath? Margaret shook her head. Ground's always been solid. No reason to think anything was down there. Sarah flipped through her notes, though what she was really doing was studying their body language. Frank kept fidgeting with his wedding ring. Margaret hadn't touched her coffee since Sarah arrived. The thing is, Sarah said carefully, I spoke with the county yesterday. Building records show some interesting discrepancies. The permits you filed in 1952 were for a standard agricultural barn, no mention of excavation or underground construction. Frank's rocking stopped. Course not. Told you, we didn't know about any underground anything. But the excavation work had to happen sometime. That concrete didn't pour itself. The electrical wiring, the ventilation system, that's professional work, expensive work. Margaret finally lifted her mug, but Sarah noticed her hands weren't quite steady. "Detective, we've lived here 68 years. If someone dug a hole under our barn, it happened before we owned the place." Sarah consulted her notes again. Actually, the previous owner was Ezra Morrison, 84-year-old dairy farmer when he sold to you. His family confirmed he never had resources for that kind of construction project, was barely scraping by, according to the bank records. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. A red-winged blackbird called from the oak tree by the drive, its trill sharp in the morning air. Frank cleared his throat. Maybe it was built during the war. Lots of strange projects then. Government things nobody talked about. It was a reasonable suggestion, but Sarah had already checked. No military installations in this area during the 1940s. No defense contracts or classified facilities. She closed her notebook and leaned forward slightly. "Here's what bothers me. Yesterday, you both seemed genuinely surprised by the discovery. But last night, I did some checking with your neighbors. Betty Morrison, that's Ezra's daughter-in-law. She remembers you and Frank asking very specific questions about the property before you bought it. Questions about the barn foundation, about whether Ezra had ever done any major construction." Margaret's mug slipped. Coffee splashed across her lap, and she jumped up with a sharp intake of breath. "Oh, clumsy me!" She hurried toward the door. "I'll just clean this up." But Sarah had caught something in that moment of surprise. Fear. Real fear. Frank was on his feet too. "Margaret gets flustered easy these days. Doctor says it's normal at her age, but—" He shrugged helplessly. "Mr. Blackwood, I need you to understand something. Those cars down there, they're not just valuable. They're evidence in an active criminal investigation. If you know anything about how they got there, anything at all, it's better to tell me now." Frank's weathered face crumpled slightly. For a moment, Sarah thought he might confess whatever secret he was carrying. Instead, he straightened his shoulders and met her eyes. "Detective, my wife and I are simple people. We've worked this land our whole lives, minded our own business, never hurt anybody. If there's criminals involved with those cars, we don't know nothing about it." Margaret reappeared in the doorway, having changed into a fresh blouse. "Frank's right. We can't help you with something we don't understand ourselves." Sarah stood, recognizing a wall when she hit one. But walls could be climbed or knocked down, given enough time and the right tools. "I'll be in touch," she said, handing Frank her card. "If anything comes to mind, anything at all, please call me." Walking back to her car, Sarah felt eyes on her back. In her peripheral vision, she caught the edge of a curtain falling back into place at an upstairs window. The Blackwoods were hiding something. The question was whether they were protecting themselves or someone else entirely. The rain hammered against the farmhouse windows as Detective Sarah Chen sat across from Eleanor Whitman in the cramped kitchen. The old woman's hands trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup, steam curling between them like unspoken secrets. Harold remained silent in his chair by the window, watching the crime scene tape flutter in the wind around their barn. "Mrs. Whitman, I need you to understand how serious this is," Sarah said, her voice gentle but firm. "Those cars down there are worth millions. The FBI is treating this as a federal investigation into organized crime." Eleanor's pale blue eyes darted to her husband before returning to Sarah. "We've told you everything we know, Detective. Harold bought this property in 1982. We had no idea what was underneath. The concrete slab was professionally poured," Sarah continued, studying Eleanor's face for any tells. "Whoever hid those cars had construction knowledge and significant resources. This wasn't some amateur operation." Harold finally spoke, his voice gravelly with age. "You think we're lying. It wasn't a question." "I think you're scared," Sarah replied. "And I think you have good reason to be." Through the window, she could see Agent Martinez coordinating with the forensics team as they carefully extracted the vehicles. The 1979 Lamborghini had already revealed partial fingerprints on the steering wheel, prints that would likely match names in various criminal databases. Eleanor set down her cup with a soft clink. "Detective, when we moved here, this was just a struggling farm. The previous owner, Mr. Kowalski, had already passed. His son just wanted to sell quickly and move to California." "Tell me about Kowalski," Sarah said, pulling out her notebook. "Joseph Kowalski," Harold said slowly, kept to himself mostly, ran cattle, some crops, nothing fancy. When he died in '81, the farm had been losing money for years. Sarah made notes, but something nagged at her. A cattle farmer with a failing operation somehow had the means to construct an underground garage. She'd need to dig deeper into Kowalski's background. Her phone buzzed with a text from Martinez, "Found something in the Porsche trunk. Come now." "I'll need to continue this later," Sarah said, standing. "Please don't leave town without letting me know." Outside, the rain had softened to a drizzle, but the excavation continued under hastily erected tarps. Sarah descended into the garage, now brightly lit with industrial work lights. The space felt different in the harsh illumination, less mysterious, more clinical. Martinez stood beside the silver Porsche 911, latex gloves on his hands. "Look at this," he said, holding up a leather briefcase, hidden in a compartment behind the spare tire. The briefcase was expensive, Italian leather with brass fittings that had aged to a deep patina. Martinez opened it carefully, revealing stacks of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be architectural blueprints. "Jesus," Sarah whispered, leaning closer. The blueprints showed detailed floor plans of a building she recognized, the Midwest Federal Reserve Bank in Chicago. Red ink marked security camera positions, guard stations, and what looked like vault specifications. Martinez lifted one of the photographs. It showed 6 men standing beside the very cars now surrounding them. The photo was dated September 1979 in faded pencil on the back. "The Millennium Heist," Sarah breathed. She'd studied the case in training. 12 million in cash and negotiable securities stolen from the Federal Reserve in 1979. The thieves had vanished without a trace, and the case remained unsolved. "Gets better," Martinez said, holding up a manila envelope thick with papers. "Looks like detailed records of money laundering operations, bank account numbers, transaction dates, contact names." Sarah studied the photograph more carefully. One of the men looked familiar, though she couldn't place where she'd seen the face. He was older than the others, wearing an expensive suit, with silver hair and sharp features. "We need to get this to the lab immediately," she said, "and I want background checks on everyone who's owned this property going back to 1950. Martinez nodded, then paused. "Sarah, there's something else. The forensics team found tire tracks in the barn above, fresh ones. Someone's been here recently, probably within the last week." A chill ran down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the damp underground air. Someone knew about this cache before the demolition crew found it. Someone who might be watching them right now. "Double the security detail," she ordered. "And I want protective surveillance on the Whitmans. If someone killed to protect this secret once, they'll do it again." As they carefully packed the briefcase and its contents, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed. The trees surrounding the property could hide a dozen watchers, and the isolation that had once protected these buried secrets now made everyone involved dangerously vulnerable. Above them, thunder rolled across the Kansas sky, and Sarah realized their investigation had just become a race against time and against killers who had already proven they would do anything to keep the truth buried. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Detective Sarah Chen barely noticed as she spread crime scene photos across her desk, like tarot cards revealing a dark future. The fluorescent lights of the precinct hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the images of Tommy Martinez's lifeless body sprawled beside his excavator. "Working late again?" Detective Mike Rodriguez dropped into the chair across from her, his own cup steaming. "Maria's going to start charging you rent if you keep sleeping here." "Look at this." Sarah pushed one of the photos toward him. The killer knew exactly where to find Tommy. He was working a night shift alone in the middle of nowhere. How does someone just happen upon that? Mike studied the image, his weathered face creasing into a frown. "You think this wasn't random?" "Nothing about this feels random." Sarah pulled out her notebook, pages filled with scrawled questions and theories. Tommy discovers the cars on Monday, dies on Tuesday night. Someone wanted him silenced fast. "Fast enough to be sloppy," Mike agreed, examining the close-up shots of the crime scene. Single gunshot to the head, execution style, professional but rushed, no attempt to make it look like an accident. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from the coroner. "Call me. Found something." 20 minutes later, they stood in the sterile brightness of the county morgue, Dr. Elizabeth Hayes pulling back the sheet covering Tommy's body with practiced efficiency. "Your killer's left-handed," she announced without preamble. "Powder burns indicate close contact, weapon held at this angle," she demonstrated with her finger. "But there's something else." Tommy fought back. She lifted the victim's right hand, revealing scraped knuckles and what looked like fabric fibers under his fingernails. He tagged his killer. Got in at least one good punch before the gun came out. Dr. Hayes carefully extracted a small evidence bag. Navy blue wool blend. Expensive. Not the kind of fabric you'd expect from a random mugging. Sarah felt the familiar tingle of a case breaking open. "Can you get DNA from the fibers?" "Already sent them to the lab." "But Sarah?" The coroner's expression grew serious. "There's something else. The trajectory of the bullet, the positioning. Your killer knew what they were doing. This wasn't some panicked robbery gone wrong. This was an assassination." Back at the station, Sarah pulled up everything she could find about the Brennan farm. Property records, dating back 60 years, revealed that Walter and Edith Brennan had purchased the land in 1963, paying cash for the entire 140 acres. Cash purchases weren't unusual for farmers, but the amount raised eyebrows, equivalent to nearly $500,000 in today's money. "Where does a young farming couple get that kind of cash in 1963? She muttered, cross-referencing the date with unsolved crimes from that era. Mike appeared at her shoulder, reading over the documents. "Maybe they inherited it?" "From who?" Both sets of parents were farmers themselves, barely scraping by according to these records. Sarah highlighted the purchase date, 1963, 3 months after the Meridian Trust robbery. She pulled up the FBI file she'd requested earlier. The Meridian Trust heist had been legendary in law enforcement circles, $6 million in cash and bearer bonds vanishing without a trace, along with the 3-man crew who'd pulled it off. The kind of score that would let someone disappear forever, maybe buy a quiet farm where they could lay low. "You think Walter Brennan was part of the heist crew?" Mike's voice carried skepticism. "The guy I met yesterday couldn't hurt a fly, been farming that land his whole adult life. Sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight." Sarah opened another file. "Look at the timeline. The robbery happens in March 1963. The heat dies down over the summer. Come fall, Walter and Edith Brennan appear in Millbrook County with cash to burn and a story about wanting the simple life." Her computer chimed with an incoming email from the FBI field office. Agent Davies had come through with the classified files on the Meridian Trust case. As Sarah scrolled through decades-old witness statements and suspect profiles, one detail made her breath catch. The getaway cars from the heist had never been recovered. 3 vehicles, a 1962 Corvette, a 1961 Porsche 356, and a 1963 Mustang prototype. According to the file, finding those cars had been considered the key to cracking the case. "Mike, look at this inventory from the hidden garage." She pulled up the list the crime scene team had compiled. 1962 Corvette Roadster red, 1961 Porsche 356 billions silver, 1963 Mustang prototype blue. The silence stretched between them as the implications sank in. "Jesus," Mike whispered, "those are the getaway cars." Sarah's mind raced through the connections. If Walter Brennan had been part of the Meridian Trust crew, if those cars in his barn were evidence of the greatest unsolved heist in American history, Then Tommy Martinez had died because he'd stumbled onto a secret worth killing for. But that raised an even more troubling question. If Walter Brennan was hiding his past, who else knew about it? And how far would they go to keep it buried? The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the metallic scent of moisture and something else. Something that made Detective Sarah Chen's instincts prickle as she approached the Henderson farm for the second time in 3 days. The yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the morning breeze like warning flags, and she could see Deputy Martinez's patrol car already parked near the barn. She'd barely slept since finding Margaret Henderson's body. The old woman's murder had transformed what seemed like a simple case of discovered stolen property into something far more sinister. Someone had been desperate enough to kill for these cars, which meant the vintage collection was worth more than anyone had initially realized. Martinez jogged over as she climbed out of her vehicle, his face grim. "We've got another problem, Detective. The federal agents arrived 20 minutes ago." "Federal agents?" Chen's stomach dropped. "What kind of federal agents?" "BI. 3 of them, led by someone named Special Agent Reeves. They're inside the underground garage right now, and they've got a warrant that supersedes our investigation." Chen cursed under her breath. Federal involvement meant this case was about to slip through her fingers, but more importantly, it confirmed her growing suspicion that these weren't ordinary stolen cars. She'd spent most of yesterday evening researching vintage automobile thefts, but nothing she'd found matched the specific makes and models in the Henderson collection. "Where's Tom Henderson?" "Still at his sister's place in Burlington. But here's the thing, when I called to inform him about the federal warrant, he didn't sound surprised. If anything, he sounded relieved." That detail bothered Chen more than she cared to admit. She'd interviewed Tom twice since his wife's murder, and both times he'd seemed genuinely shocked about the underground garage. Either he was an exceptional actor, or there were layers to this story that no one had uncovered yet. They walked toward the barn, and Chen could hear voices echoing up from the hidden garage below. The entrance that had been carefully concealed for decades now gaped open like a wound, surrounded by construction equipment and evidence markers. Special Agent Reeves emerged as they approached, a tall woman in her 40s with steel-grey hair pulled back severely and eyes that missed nothing. She wore the kind of expensive suit that suggested federal budgets and high-profile cases. "Detective Chen, I presume? I'm Agent Reeves. I understand you've been handling this investigation." "Until about 5 minutes ago, yes." Chen kept her voice level, professional. "Mind telling me why the FBI is interested in some old cars?" Reeves studied her for a moment, clearly weighing how much to reveal. "These aren't just old cars, Detective. Preliminary examination suggests they're connected to the Meridian armored car robbery of 1987. Have you heard of it?" The name struck Chen like a physical blow. Every law enforcement officer in the region knew about Meridian. It was legendary, the kind of case that made careers and broke others. 36 years ago, 3 armed men had hijacked an armored car carrying cash and bearer bonds worth over $12 million. The theft had been meticulously planned and flawlessly executed. The perpetrators had vanished without a trace, along with the money. "You're saying these cars were part of the getaway?" "We're saying these cars were the payout, the bonds that were stolen. They were being transported to a private auction. Specifically, an auction of vintage automobiles that was being held the following week. The thieves didn't just steal money, Detective. They stole the cars that money was meant to buy." Martinez whistled low. "So the Hendersons were part of the robbery crew? That's what we're trying to determine." Reeves glanced back toward the garage entrance. "But there's a complication. According to our records, all 3 suspects in the Meridian robbery died in a car accident 6 months after the theft. Their bodies were identified, the case was officially closed. Yet here are the cars, hidden beneath a farm owned by a couple who supposedly had no connection to the crime." Chen's mind raced through the implications. Someone else was involved, a 4th person who was never identified. "Or," Reeves said carefully, "the 3 men didn't actually die in that accident. Maybe someone helped them fake their deaths. establish new identities. Maybe Tom and Margaret Henderson weren't just hiding stolen cars, maybe they were hiding stolen people. The weight of that possibility settled over them like a shroud. If the Henderson farm had been a safe house for the Meridian robbers, then Margaret's murder wasn't random violence. Someone had discovered the truth after all these years and decided to tie up loose ends. "There's something else," Reeves continued. "The construction crew that found the garage? We've been running background checks on all of them. One of the workers, Danny Kozlov, has a sealed juvenile record. His father was a security guard for Meridian Armored Car Company in 1987. Chen felt the pieces clicking into place with terrible clarity. The discovery of the garage hadn't been accidental. Someone had known exactly what they were looking for, and now people were dying to keep the truth buried. The rain hammered against the windows of the state police barracks as Detective Sarah Chen spread the case files across her desk. 3 deaths in 5 days, all connected to a collection of cars that shouldn't exist. She rubbed her tired eyes and reached for another cup of coffee, knowing sleep wouldn't come easy tonight. Marcus Webb's autopsy report lay open beside crime scene photos from the farm. The medical examiner had confirmed what Sarah suspected. Webb died from a single gunshot wound to the chest, fired at close range. But it was the other details that troubled her. Webb had defensive wounds on his hands and forearms, suggesting he'd fought his attacker before being shot. More disturbing was the trace evidence found under his fingernails, skin cells and blood that didn't match his DNA. His killer had been injured in the struggle. Sarah's phone buzzed. "Chen, Detective, it's Officer Martinez at County General. That journalist, Rebecca Stone? She's awake and asking for you." 20 minutes later, Sarah stood beside Rebecca's hospital bed, noting the woman's pale complexion and the way her eyes darted nervously around the room. The bandages covering the gash on her forehead were stark white against her dark hair. "You said you had information about the cars," Sarah began gently. "Something you couldn't tell me before." Rebecca's voice was barely above a whisper. "I found something in the Hartwell house before someone tried to kill me." She reached under her pillow and withdrew a small key. This was hidden behind a loose baseboard in their bedroom. Sarah examined the key. It was old, brass, with numbers etched into its surface, 1247. "What does it open?" "I think it's a safety deposit box. The numbers match a box at First National Bank downtown." I checked. Rebecca's grip tightened on the hospital sheets. "Someone's been paying the rental fee for 40 years. Anonymous cashier's checks, postmarked from different cities." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Who's been making the payments?" "That's what I was trying to figure out when they attacked me." Rebecca touched her bandaged head gingerly. "But I think I know why Marcus Webb had to die. He wasn't just documenting those cars for insurance purposes, he was authenticating them." "What do you mean?" Rebecca's eyes met Sarah's. "Those vehicles aren't just valuable, they're evidence." Webb was comparing VIN numbers, paint samples, everything. He'd figured out that at least 6 of those cars were reported stolen in major heists dating back to the 1970s, including 3 from the Meridian Museum job. Sarah's blood ran cold. The Meridian Museum heist was legendary in law enforcement circles, a perfectly executed robbery that netted thieves over $50 million in cash, jewelry, and classic automobiles. The case had gone cold decades ago, but it remained one of the FBI's most wanted investigations. Webb was going to turn his findings over to the FBI, Rebecca continued. But someone found out, someone who's been protecting that secret for 40 years. Before Sarah could respond, her phone rang. The caller ID showed her partner's number. "Chen here." "Sarah, we've got a problem. That demolition crew foreman, Tony Castellano? He's missing. His wife says he never came home last night, and his truck's been found abandoned near the river." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the case spiraling beyond her control. "Any signs of struggle?" "Blood on the driver's seat." "And Sarah, there's something else. We ran those partial prints from Webb's workshop through the system. We got a hit." "Who?" "Vincent Romano. Did 20 years for armed robbery, got out in 1995. But here's the interesting part. He was arrested in 1983 as a suspect in the Meridian Museum job. Charges were dropped due to insufficient evidence. Sarah's mind raced. Romano would be in his 70s now, old enough to have been part of the original heist, old enough to have spent 4 decades protecting his secret. Current address? That's the problem. He's been off the grid for years. Last known residence was a cabin outside Millfield, but it burned down in 2018. Officially, Vincent Romano doesn't exist anymore. Sarah ended the call and turned back to Rebecca, whose face had gone even paler. "Vincent Romano," Sarah said. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Rebecca nodded slowly. "I've been researching the families in this area for months. Romano owned a small auto repair shop in town back in the 80s. He employed several local residents, including—" She paused, her eyes widening. "Including Thomas Hartwell." The pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind. Hartwell hadn't just been storing stolen cars. He'd been part of the original theft. The farm had been the perfect hiding place, isolated and beyond suspicion. But now the secret was out, and someone was willing to commit murder to protect it. "We need to get you into protective custody," Sarah said, but Rebecca was already shaking her head. "That safety deposit box, whatever's in there, might be the key to everything. The real question is, who else knows about it?" Outside, thunder rolled across the darkening sky, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. The rain drummed against the windows of Detective Sarah Chen's apartment as she spread the contents of Margaret Thornfield's box across her coffee table. The lamp cast harsh shadows over decades-old photographs, yellowed newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes that seemed to whisper secrets from the past. She picked up a photograph of 5 men standing beside what appeared to be the same 1957 Thunderbird, now sitting in the evidence garage. The men were young, confident, their suits impeccable, despite the grease stains on their hands. On the back, someone had written names in fading ink. Tommy, Sal, Frank, Eddie, Mickey, Chicago, 1962. Her phone buzzed. "Chen here." "Detective, it's Officer Martinez. You need to get down to the station. We've got a problem." 20 minutes later, Chen stood in the evidence garage staring at empty spaces where 3 of the vintage cars had been. The security footage showed nothing. Somehow the cameras had malfunctioned for exactly 47 minutes between midnight and 12:47 a.m. How the hell does someone steal 3 classic cars from a police evidence garage? Chief Morrison's voice echoed off the concrete walls. "Inside job," Chen said flatly. "Had to be. Someone with access codes, knowledge of our security protocols, and connections to move hot merchandise fast." She thought about the box still sitting on her coffee table, about Margaret Thornfield's terrified eyes before the explosion. The old woman had known this would happen. She'd been waiting for it. Back at her apartment, Chen dove deeper into the documents. A Western Union telegram dated October 15, 1962 caught her attention, package delivered safely. "Uncle Thomas sends his regards. Will write soon." It was signed M.T. Margaret Thornfield. The pieces began forming a picture she didn't like. The dates aligned perfectly with the Millennium Trust heist in Chicago, when armed men had stolen bonds and cash worth over 30 million in today's currency. The case had gone cold when the entire crew seemingly vanished without a trace. Her laptop chimed with an email from the forensics lab. The soil samples from beneath the barn showed evidence of a concrete foundation that had been poured sometime in the early 1960s. More interesting was the chemical analysis. Traces of ink and paper consistent with security documents from that era had been found in the soil. Chen's blood went cold. They hadn't just stored the cars down there. They'd destroyed evidence, probably burned the bonds and paperwork thinking the cash was enough to disappear on. A knock at her door made her freeze. It was nearly midnight, and she wasn't expecting anyone. She drew her weapon and approached cautiously. "Detective Chen? It's Frank Castellano. We need to talk." Through the peephole she saw an elderly man in an expensive overcoat, his hands visible and empty. Something about his voice carried authority even through the door. About what? About Margaret. About the cars. About why 3 more people are going to die if you don't listen to me. Against her better judgment, she opened the door, keeping her gun ready. Castellano stepped inside, his eyes immediately finding the document spread across her table. He was older than she'd expected, probably in his 70s, but his movements were sharp and deliberate. "You're one of them," she said. "From the photo." He nodded slowly. "Frank Benedetto back then. We all changed our names after Chicago." He gestured to the papers. "Margaret kept records. We told her not to, but she said someone needed to remember what really happened." "You mean the heist?" "The heist was supposed to be simple. In and out, no violence. But Tommy got greedy, started thinking about bigger scores. When we tried to split up the money and disappear, he decided he wanted it all. Chen kept her weapon trained on him but felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. He killed the others. 3 of them, yeah. Made it look like they'd skipped town with their shares. But Sal and I knew better. We helped Margaret and her husband Henry hide the cars and destroy the evidence. Figured if Tommy came looking, he'd find nothing. And now he's back." Castellano's face darkened. "Tommy Torino never left. He's been watching, waiting. When those demolition workers found the garage, word got out fast. Too fast. Tommy's got people everywhere. Cops, city officials, courthouse clerks. The implication hit her like a physical blow. Someone in the department is feeding him information. How else would he know to steal those specific cars? They weren't just transportation, detective." Tommy hollowed out the door panels, the seats, even the engine blocks. 30 million in cash doesn't just disappear. It gets very carefully hidden. Chen lowered her weapon slightly. "Why come to me? Why not run?" "Because I'm 74 years old and I'm tired of running. Margaret died protecting a secret that's gotten too heavy to carry." He looked directly at her. "And because Tommy is planning to tie up loose ends, starting with you." Outside, a car engine revved in the parking lot, then fell silent. The hospital corridors felt endless as Sarah hurried toward the ICU, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors. Detective Morrison had called 20 minutes ago with news that made her stomach drop. Frank Castellano had been found beaten nearly to death in his cell, and before losing consciousness, he'd managed to whisper her name to the guards. She found Morrison pacing outside the intensive care unit, his usually composed demeanor cracked with frustration. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and his shirt looked like he'd slept in it. "How bad is it?" Sarah asked, catching her breath. 3 broken ribs, collapsed lung, severe concussion. The doctors aren't sure if he'll make it through the night. Morrison's jaw tightened. This was professional work, Sarah. Someone got to him inside a maximum security facility. Through the window of his room, Sarah could see Frank's still form connected to a web of tubes and monitors. His face was so swollen she barely recognized the man who'd sat across from her in the interrogation room just days earlier. What did he say exactly? Morrison pulled out his notebook. Guard heard him whisper Sarah Mitchell and something that sounded like journal. Then he flatlined for 30 seconds before they got him back. Journal. Sarah's mind raced. Frank had been trying to tell her something about a journal before the attack interrupted their conversation. But what journal? And where? "We need to search his apartment again," she said. "Already tried. Place was tossed sometime between his arrest and this morning. Professional job, nothing broken, but everything had been carefully searched." A nurse emerged from Frank's room, checking her watch. "He's stable for now, but visiting is restricted to family only." Sarah showed her press credentials. "I'm working with the police on his case. He specifically asked to speak with me." The nurse hesitated, then glanced at Morrison's badge. 5 minutes, don't upset him." Inside the room, the steady beeping of monitors filled the silence. Sarah approached the bed carefully, noting how small Frank looked beneath the hospital sheets. His breathing was shallow but steady. "Frank?" she whispered. "It's Sarah Mitchell. You asked for me." His eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly. When he saw her, relief flooded his bruised features. "Sarah?" His voice was barely audible through the oxygen mask. She leaned closer. They found out I talked to you. Who found out? Frank, who's behind this? He struggled to speak, each word an effort. The journal. Rose kept a journal. She wrote everything down, every meeting, every plan. Rose Henley. Sarah's pulse quickened. The old woman had documented their activities. Where is it, Frank? Where's the journal? Hidden. In the barn. Rose was smart, paranoid. She kept records as insurance. His breathing became labored. Look for the loose floorboard near the old milking stalls. She showed me once, said if anything happened. The monitors began beeping more rapidly. Frank gripped Sarah's wrist with surprising strength. Be careful. They have people everywhere. Police, FBI, City Hall, the money from those cars. It bought a lot of loyalty over the years. Who's they, Frank? Give me a name. But Frank's eyes were already closing, his grip loosening as sedation pulled him under. The nurse returned, checking the monitors with concern. That's enough. He needs rest. Outside in the corridor, Sarah shared what Frank had told her with Morrison. The detective ran a hand through his hair, looking older than his years. A journal. If Rose Henley really documented everything, it could blow this case wide open. But it also means we're walking into a trap. Someone's been watching that farm since we found the cars, Sarah said. They've had weeks to search for anything incriminating. Maybe they didn't know where to look. You said Rose was paranoid. She might have hidden it well. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Stop looking or you'll end up like your friend. She showed Morrison, who immediately called for a trace. As they waited, Sarah's mind churned through the implications. Whoever was behind this had resources, connections, and the willingness to kill. Frank's beating was a message, but it was also proof they were getting close to something important. We go tonight, Morrison said quietly. Just us. If there really are compromised cops involved, we can't trust anyone else. Sarah nodded, though her stomach twisted with anxiety. The abandoned Henley farm felt different now. Not just the site of a decades-old crime, but an active threat. Yet Rose's journal might contain the answers they desperately needed. As they left the hospital, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling they were being watched. In the parking garage, shadows seemed deeper, and every footstep that wasn't theirs made her heart race. Frank had risked his life to point them toward the truth. Now it was up to them to find it before someone else ended up in intensive care. Or worse. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town felt like a tomb as Detective Sarah Chen stepped through the rusted doorway. Her flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing footprints in the dust that were far too recent for comfort. Marcus followed close behind, his hand resting on his weapon. This is where Tommy said he was supposed to meet his contact, Marcus whispered, sweeping his light across empty oil drums and scattered debris. The guy who claimed he had information about the Castellano family. Sarah nodded grimly. Tommy Rossini had been their best lead, a low-level fence who'd bragged about knowing the real story behind the vintage cars. Now he was lying in the morgue with a bullet in his head, found floating in the river just 12 hours after he'd called them. Over here, Marcus called softly. Sarah joined him beside a makeshift table constructed from wooden crates. Fresh coffee stains marked the surface, and cigarette butts littered the ground. Someone had been here recently, very recently. Look at this, Sarah said, crouching beside the table. Her fingers traced over papers scattered beneath it, documents that had clearly been dropped in haste. She gathered them carefully, her pulse quickening as she read. Marcus, these are shipping manifests from 1973. The dates matched perfectly with the heist timeline. Sarah's eyes scanned the faded carbon copies, noting routes from Chicago to various Midwest locations. One destination made her blood run cold, Millbrook Township, specifically a farm owned by Henry and Eleanor Ashford. Son of a bitch, Marcus breathed, reading over her shoulder. The Ashfords were in on it from the beginning. Before Sarah could respond, the distant sound of an engine made them both freeze. Headlights swept across the warehouse's broken windows as a vehicle approached. Sarah quickly stuffed the manifests into her jacket and motioned for Marcus to take cover behind a support beam. The engine shut off, and footsteps crunched on gravel outside. Sarah held her breath as two figures entered the warehouse, one tall and lean, the other shorter and stockier. In the dim light filtering through the windows, she couldn't make out their faces, but their voices carried clearly in the empty space. "You said you handled the Rossini problem," the taller figure said, his tone sharp with irritation. "I did handle it. Kids' fish food now." The stockier man's voice was gravelly, older, but he might have already talked to the cops. "Then we accelerate the timeline. Tomorrow night, we clear out everything from the secondary location and disappear. 60 years is long enough to sit on this." Sarah's mind raced. Secondary location? There were more cars hidden somewhere else? What about the Ashford property? The cops have it locked down tight. The tall man chuckled darkly. "Let them have those cars. They're just the tip of the iceberg. The real prize was never hidden under that barn." Sarah exchanged a meaningful glance with Marcus. They'd been focused on the wrong location entirely. The old man was clever. The gravelly voice continued. "Split the haul 3 ways, 1 cache at the farm to throw off any investigation, 1 at the warehouse and the main collection." He paused, and Sarah strained to hear. "Well, that stays buried until we're ready to move it." "And the girl? The one asking questions?" Sarah's blood chilled. They had to be talking about Jessica, the young woman who'd been digging into her grandfather's past. "She's getting too close. Her grandfather should have kept his mouth shut instead of getting sentimental in his old age." The tall man's voice carried a cold finality that made Sarah's stomach clench. "Take care of it," the shorter man grunted acknowledgement. "What about the cops? They found the manifests yet?" Sarah's hand instinctively moved to the papers in her jacket. How did they know about the manifests? "Doesn't matter. Those documents only tell part of the story. Without the key, they'll never find the main cache." Footsteps began moving toward the exit. 24 hours, then we're ghosts." The men departed as quickly as they'd arrived, leaving Sarah and Marcus crouched in the darkness with racing hearts and more questions than answers. Sarah waited a full 5 minutes before emerging from cover, her mind spinning with implications. "We need to find Jessica," she said urgently. "If they're planning to take care of it tomorrow." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the warehouse's cold air. They'd been thinking too small, focusing on a decades-old crime when the real danger was immediate and deadly. Somewhere in their town, a young woman's life hung in the balance, and the key to a fortune in stolen goods remained hidden. The manifests in her jacket suddenly felt heavier, weighted with the knowledge that they stumbled into something far more complex and dangerous than a simple cold case. The ghosts of 1973 were very much alive, and they were running out of time. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town felt like stepping into a tomb. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stale air. Marcus stayed close behind her, his own light sweeping the corners where shadows seemed to breathe. "This was where Benjamin worked after he left the bank," Sarah whispered, though there was no one to overhear. Eleanor's diary mentioned he had a workshop here. They'd left Detective Morrison at the station, poring over the evidence they'd already collected. The diary had revealed more than they'd initially realized. Coded references to meetings, preparations, and most importantly, a location where Benjamin had supposedly hidden something crucial. Marcus ran his light along the concrete walls, searching for any sign of disturbance. If he hid evidence here, it would have to be somewhere the current owners wouldn't find it during routine maintenance. The warehouse had changed hands 3 times since the 1970s, but the basic structure remained unchanged. Sarah studied Eleanor's careful handwriting in the diary pages, translating the elderly woman's cryptic references to Benjamin's special place where the angels watch. "Angels," she muttered, looking up. The beam of her flashlight caught something metallic in the rafters, an ornate weather vane in the shape of an angel, clearly out of place in the industrial setting. "There," she pointed. Marcus squinted upward. How do we get up there? They found a maintenance ladder against the far wall. The rungs groaned under Marcus's weight as he climbed, flashlight clamped between his teeth. 20 feet up, he reached the weather vane and felt around its base. There's something here, he called down. Feels like a metal box, bolted to the beam. Sarah's pulse quickened. Can you get it down? The sound of scraping metal echoed through the warehouse as Marcus worked to free whatever Benjamin had hidden decades ago. Finally, a small object clattered to the concrete floor. Sarah rushed to examine it, a weatherproof military surplus container, the kind designed to survive harsh conditions. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, they found a collection of photographs, documents, and a reel-to-reel tape. The photographs made her stomach turn. They showed the aftermath of the heist, but not from any crime scene she'd seen in the official files. These were taken inside what appeared to be a farmhouse, specifically Eleanor and Benjamin's farmhouse. Stacks of cash covered their kitchen table. The stolen bearer bonds were spread across their bed, and there, clear as day, were 2 additional figures she didn't recognize. Marcus, look at this. She held up a photograph showing Benjamin shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit. The date stamp says this was taken 3 days after the heist. Marcus climbed down and studied the image. That's not one of the original suspects. Who is he? The documents provided the answer. Benjamin had kept meticulous records, including bank statements showing regular payments to something called Pacific Holdings, Limited, over a period of 15 years following the heist. The payments stopped in 1987, the year Benjamin died. But it was the final document that made Sarah's blood run cold. A life insurance policy on Eleanor Hartwell, purchased just 3 months ago by Pacific Holdings Limited. The beneficiary was listed as Estate Holdings, to be determined upon death. Someone was planning to kill Eleanor, she breathed. They probably did kill her. Marcus was already reaching for his phone. We need to get this to Morrison immediately. If Pacific Holdings is still active. The warehouse light suddenly blazed to life, blinding them both. Sarah dropped the documents, her hand moving instinctively toward her weapon, but she'd left it locked in her car's glove compartment. I wouldn't move if I were you, a calm voice said from the entrance. Their eyes adjusted to reveal Detective Morrison walking toward them, but his demeanor had changed completely. Gone was the helpful colleague, replaced by someone cold and calculating. You've been very thorough, Morrison continued, gesturing at the scattered evidence. More thorough than I expected when I assigned you to this case. Sarah's mind raced. You knew. You've known all along. My father was the original detective on the case, Thomas Morrison. He was also on Pacific Holdings' payroll. Morrison's smile was devoid of warmth. When the old couple died and those cars turned up, I thought the secret had died with them. But then Eleanor had to go and leave that diary behind. Marcus stepped protectively in front of Sarah. So you killed her? A small miscalculation with her medication. She was old, dying anyway. No one questioned it. Morrison drew his service weapon, just like no one will question what happens when 2 journalists get too curious and stumble into the wrong warehouse at the wrong time. Sarah frantically calculated distances, exits, options. The evidence lay scattered at their feet, proof of decades of corruption and murder. If Morrison succeeded now, the truth would die with them in this forgotten warehouse, just another cold case file gathering dust. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town felt like a tomb when Sarah stepped inside, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Detective Mills had insisted on meeting here after receiving her call about the photograph, claiming it wasn't safe to discuss at the station. Now, standing in the dim light filtering through grimy windows, she wondered if she'd made a terrible mistake. You came alone. Good. Mills emerged from behind a stack of rotting crates, his service weapon drawn but lowered. Show me what you found. Sarah's hand trembled as she pulled the faded photograph from her jacket pocket. This was in my grandmother's things. She never told me about any of this. The image showed a younger version of her grandmother standing beside a gleaming 1963 Ferrari, arms linked with two men Sarah didn't recognize, except one wore a police uniform from decades past. Mills studied the photo, his jaw tightening. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Hidden in her jewelry box, behind a false bottom." There were others too, pictures of cars, newspaper clippings about the Gardner Museum heist. Sarah's voice cracked. "Was my grandmother involved in stealing those cars?" The detective's laugh was bitter. "Your grandmother wasn't a thief, Sarah. She was a witness, the only witness who could have blown everything wide open." He tucked the photograph into his vest, "And now you know why she had to die." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that heart attack wasn't natural, just like Frank's accident wasn't an accident, and Henry's fall down those stairs wasn't clumsiness." Mills began pacing, his agitation growing. 37 years I've kept this secret. 37 years of watching my back, making sure the truth stayed buried with everyone who knew it." Sarah backed toward the door, but Mills raised his weapon. "I can't let you leave, Sarah. You understand that, don't you?" His voice carried a note of genuine regret. "I never wanted it to go this far, but you kids just couldn't leave well enough alone. You were part of the heist." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity, the inside man. That's how they knew when the museum would be vulnerable. Mills nodded slowly. "I was young, stupid, desperate for money. My wife needed surgery we couldn't afford, and these guys offered me more cash than I'd see in 10 years of police work. All I had to do was make sure security was looking the other way at the right time. But something went wrong. Everything went wrong. The plan was clean. Get in, take specific pieces, get out. No violence, no witnesses. But Frank and Henry got greedy, started taking everything they could carry, making noise, leaving evidence." Mills wiped sweat from his forehead despite the warehouse's chill. "Your grandmother lived in the apartment above her flower shop across from the museum. She saw us loading the cars, got suspicious when the story didn't match what she witnessed." Sarah's mind raced, searching for an escape route while keeping him talking. "So you've been killing them off one by one?" "I protected them for decades. Made sure investigations went cold, evidence disappeared, witnesses forgot what they'd seen. But when those cars surfaced," he shook his head. "Frank was about to confess everything to that documentary crew, said he couldn't live with the guilt anymore. I couldn't let that happen, because it would expose your involvement. Because it would destroy everything I've built. My reputation, my pension, my family's future." Mills's grip tightened on the gun. "I'm not proud of what I've done, but I'm not going to prison for a mistake I made 40 years ago." The warehouse door crashed open behind Sarah, and she dove sideways as shots erupted. Through the chaos, she saw Marcus rolling behind cover, his own weapon drawn. Where had he come from? "Drop it, Mills," Marcus shouted. "FBI's got the building surrounded." "You think I'm stupid enough to believe that?" Mills fired toward Marcus's position, splintering wood. "I know you've been working alone, trying to play hero." Sarah crawled toward a pile of debris, her heart hammering. She could hear Marcus moving, using the warehouse's maze of abandoned equipment for cover. Mills seemed to have lost track of both of them in the shadows. "It's over, Mills," Marcus called out. "We found Henry's recording. He documented everything before you killed him. Names, dates, your confession about the museum job. The lie was perfect." Sarah saw Mills falter, confusion and panic warring across his features. "That's impossible. Henry was barely conscious when I—" Mills caught himself, but the admission hung in the air like smoke. Marcus seized the moment, emerging from cover with his weapon trained on the detective. "When you what, Mills? When you pushed him down those stairs?" For a moment, the warehouse fell silent except for the sound of Sarah's ragged breathing. Then Mills raised his gun toward Marcus, and Sarah knew one of them wasn't walking out alive. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town felt like stepping into a tomb. Sarah's flashlight cut through the darkness as she and Detective Rodriguez moved cautiously between towering shelves of rusted machinery and forgotten inventory. The air hung thick with decades of dust and decay. "Marcus said the evidence would be here," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the settling creaks of the old building. "Third row, behind the blue tarp." Rodriguez nodded, his hand resting on his service weapon. They'd lost contact with Marcus Chen 3 hours ago, right after he'd called with the location of what he claimed was proof of the conspiracy surrounding the Blackwood heist. Sarah's stomach churned with worry. Marcus had sounded terrified on that final call. Their footsteps echoed hollowly as they navigated deeper into the warehouse maze. Sarah's mind raced through the connections they'd uncovered. The Henley family's desperate financial situation in 1962, the convenient disappearance of bank records, and most damning of all, the discovery that Police Chief Henley's father had been the lead investigator on the original case. There, Rodriguez pointed ahead to where a weathered blue tarp hung like a curtain across one of the aisles. Sarah pulled back the heavy canvas, revealing a small clearing where someone had arranged several cardboard boxes and manila folders on a makeshift table. Her heart jumped when she recognized Marcus's handwriting on the labels. He'd been here, but where was he now? "Jesus Christ," Rodriguez breathed, picking up a faded photograph from the top of the nearest pile. "This is from the crime scene. Look at the timestamp. This was taken after the official investigation closed." Sarah leaned closer, her flashlight illuminating the black and white image. It showed the interior of Blackwood Federal, but not as she'd seen it in the case files. This photo captured someone carefully replacing floor tiles, installing what looked like a false wall where the vault had been. "Someone was covering up evidence," she said, flipping through more photographs. Each image told part of the story: the careful removal of damaged vault components, the installation of new fixtures, the systematic elimination of any trace that the robbery had been an inside job. Rodriguez held up a manila folder marked H Family Financial Records 1960 to 1965. Inside were bank statements showing massive deposits starting just months after the heist. Deposits that coincided with the family's purchase of the farm property where they'd eventually hidden the stolen cars. The Henleys weren't just involved, Sarah realized, the pieces finally clicking into place. They orchestrated the entire thing. The bank robbery was never meant to look solved. It was meant to look impossible. A soft scraping sound from somewhere deeper in the warehouse made them both freeze. Rodriguez drew his weapon, motioning for Sarah to stay behind him. They'd been so focused on the evidence that they hadn't been watching their backs. "I know you're here," a familiar voice called out from the darkness. Chief Henley emerged from behind a stack of crates, his own gun drawn but pointed downward. "I saw your car outside." Sarah's mouth went dry. "Where's Marcus?" "Safe. For now." Henley's face looked haggard in the flashlight beam, years of carrying his family's secret etched into every line. "I never wanted it to come to this. I spent my whole career trying to make up for what my father did." "Then help us end it," Rodriguez said, keeping his weapon trained on the chief. "Tell us the truth." Henley laughed bitterly. "The truth? The truth is my father was a good cop who got desperate. His partner on the force, my Uncle Tommy, owed money to some very bad people. The bank job was supposed to be clean, just enough to pay the debt and disappear. No one was supposed to get hurt. But the security guard wasn't supposed to be there that night." Henley's voice cracked. "When he showed up unexpectedly, Tommy panicked. Shot him. Everything went to hell after that. My father couldn't turn in his own brother, but he couldn't let him get away with murder either." Sarah felt a chill of understanding. So he made the evidence disappear, made it look like an unsolvable mystery instead of what it really was, a cop killing a man for money. Dad hid the cars, thinking someday he'd find a way to return the money anonymously. But Tommy died in Vietnam 2 years later, and Dad just couldn't face admitting what he'd covered up. So the secret stayed buried. "Until the demolition," Rodriguez said. Henley nodded. "I've been trying to contain this ever since, but too many people know now, too many loose ends." The warehouse fell silent, except for the distant sound of sirens approaching. Sarah realized with growing dread that those weren't rescue vehicles. They were part of Henley's plan. "I'm sorry," he said, raising his gun. "I can't let you destroy my family's name. Not after everything I've sacrificed to protect it." In the distance, car doors slammed. Heavy footsteps began moving through the warehouse, searching for them in the darkness. The headlights cut through the darkness as Sarah's truck bounced down the gravel road toward the Henley farm. Marcus gripped the dashboard, his knuckles white against the worn leather. Behind them, Detective Rodriguez followed in her unmarked sedan, emergency lights dark to avoid drawing attention. "Tell me again why we're not waiting for backup," Marcus said, his voice tight with tension. Sarah's jaw was set, her eyes fixed on the road ahead, because by morning those cars could be gone. Henderson's had 40 years to plan his exit strategy. We're not giving him another night. The farm appeared in the distance, a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. Most of the windows were black, but a faint glow emanated from the barn where the hidden garage lay beneath. Sarah killed the headlights and coasted the final 100 yards, pulling off the road behind a cluster of oak trees. Rodriguez parked beside them, and the three huddled together in the cool night air. The detective checked her weapon and radio. "Local units are 15 minutes out. State police are 20. If Henderson's here, we wait." "And if he's not alone?" Sarah asked. "Then we definitely wait." They moved across the field in single file, keeping low and using the shadows of the fence line for cover. The barn loomed larger as they approached, and Sarah could see that the main doors were open, light spilling out onto the packed earth. Rodriguez held up her hand, stopping them 50 yards from the entrance. She pulled out binoculars and studied the scene. 2 vehicles, black sedan, looks like a rental, white panel van with Illinois plates. "Henderson didn't come alone," Marcus whispered. "And he's planning to move merchandise," Sarah added. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. They crept closer, close enough to hear voices echoing from inside the barn. Rodriguez drew her weapon and gestured for Sarah and Marcus to stay back, but Sarah shook her head. She needed to see this through. Inside the barn, the hydraulic lift hummed as it raised the floor section, revealing the pristine garage beneath. But the scene below had changed dramatically. Several of the vintage cars were missing, and the remaining vehicles were surrounded by men in coveralls methodically removing parts and documentation. Henderson stood near the 1947 Tucker, supervising the operation with military precision. He'd shed his folksy farmer persona entirely, barking orders with the authority of someone accustomed to command. "The manifests go in the van first," he said to a thin man with nervous eyes. "Then the smaller pieces. Save the engines for last. They're the hardest to trace." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. They weren't just moving stolen cars, they were dismantling history itself. Rodriguez spoke quietly into her radio, updating dispatch on the situation. The nearest units were still 10 minutes away, but Henderson's crew was working with practiced efficiency. In 10 minutes, critical evidence could be gone forever. "We have to stop them," Sarah whispered. "We wait for backup," Rodriguez replied firmly. That's when Sarah saw him, Frank Kowalski, the demolition foreman, emerging from behind one of the cars. But he wasn't a prisoner. He was directing 2 other men as they loaded wooden crates into the panel van. "Frank's in on it," she breathed. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. The man who'd first shown her the garage, who'd seemed as amazed as anyone by the discovery, had been part of Henderson's operation all along. Henderson checked his watch and called out, "20 minutes, people. I want everything movable in those vehicles." Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm. "They're almost done. We can't wait." Rodriguez looked torn, her training warring with the reality of the situation. If they waited for backup, Henderson would escape with 40 years of stolen history. If they moved now, they'd be outnumbered 3-1. The decision was made for them when Henderson's thin companion emerged from the garage, carrying a manila folder thick with documents. As he walked toward the van, he glanced in their direction. For a moment, Sarah thought they hadn't been spotted. Then the man's eyes widened in recognition. "Company!" he shouted, dropping the folder and reaching inside his jacket. Rodriguez was already moving, her badge and weapon visible. "Police! Everyone on the ground!" The barn erupted in chaos. Henderson's men scattered, some diving behind cars, others running for the exits. The thin man pulled a pistol, and Rodriguez tackled Sarah and Marcus to the ground as the first shot rang out. From their position behind a hay bale, Sarah watched Henderson grab a briefcase and sprint toward a back exit she hadn't noticed before. Frank Kowalski was shouting orders, trying to coordinate an escape, but the carefully orchestrated operation had dissolved into panic. Another gunshot echoed through the barn, and Sarah heard Rodriguez curse as she called for immediate backup. In the distance, sirens began to wail, but Sarah knew they might be too late. Henderson was escaping, and with him, the answers to questions that had haunted investigators for 4 decades. The warehouse smelled of rust and abandoned dreams. Sarah crouched behind a stack of moldering crates, her heart hammering against her ribs as footsteps echoed through the cavernous space. Detective Morrison pressed close beside her, his service weapon drawn, eyes scanning the shadows that seemed to shift and breathe in the dim light filtering through grimy windows. "You sure he followed us here?" Morrison whispered, his breath warm against her ear. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. 20 minutes ago they'd spotted Vincent Kellerman's black sedan tailing them from the courthouse. The man who'd spent 47 years covering his tracks wasn't about to let them walk away with the truth about the Meridian bank heist. A metallic clang echoed from somewhere deeper in the warehouse. Morrison tensed, raising his weapon. They'd chosen this place deliberately, an abandoned auto parts facility where they could control the confrontation. But now, surrounded by towers of rusted machinery and forgotten inventory, Sarah wondered if they'd walked into their own tomb. "I know you're here." Kellerman's voice drifted through the gloom, cultured and calm despite everything. Sarah Chen, the ambitious reporter who couldn't leave well enough alone. And Detective Morrison, the Boy Scout who thinks justice matters more than survival. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering the documents they'd found in Eleanor Hartwell's safety deposit box. Bank blueprints, guard schedules, and most damning of all, a handwritten letter from Vincent Kellerman to Eleanor's husband Frank, detailing how they'd used the farm as a hiding place until the heat died down. Only Frank had suffered his heart attack before they could move the cars, and Eleanor had kept the secret, too terrified to speak. 47 years, Kellerman continued, his footsteps growing closer. 47 years of building a respectable life, a successful law practice, a family, grandchildren who think their grandfather is a pillar of the community. Morrison motioned for Sarah to stay put, then began moving toward the voice, using the machinery as cover. But Kellerman was clever. His voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the metal surfaces. "You have no idea what that money meant," Kellerman said. "What it bought. Not just for me, but for everyone it touched. The jobs I created, the charities I funded, the good I've done with blood money made clean." Sarah spotted movement in her peripheral vision and turned to see a figure emerging from behind a massive engine block. But it wasn't Kellerman. It was a younger man, maybe 30, with the same sharp features and cold eyes. His son, she realized with growing dread. This wasn't just about one old criminal protecting his secret. This was about a legacy. The younger Kellerman held a pistol with the confidence of someone who knew how to use it. He'd positioned himself with a clear view of Morrison's location, though the detective hadn't noticed him yet. Sarah's mind raced. She could shout a warning, but that would give away her own position. The evidence they'd gathered was solid. Financial records showing how Vincent Kellerman had gradually legitimized the stolen money through a series of careful investments and shell companies. But evidence wouldn't matter if they were dead. "The beautiful thing about time," Vincent Kellerman's voice continued, "is how it changes everything. Frank Hartwell died keeping my secret. Eleanor took it to her grave. And now I find myself facing 2 more people who think they understand justice." Morrison had stopped moving, apparently realizing he was walking into a trap. The warehouse fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the whisper of wind through broken windows. Sarah made her decision. She pulled out her phone and activated the recording app they'd set up to live stream to the cloud. Whatever happened next, there would be a record. "The thing about justice, Mr. Kellerman," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the space, "is that it doesn't have an expiration date." The response was immediate. Gunfire erupted from two directions. Morrison dove for cover as the younger Kellerman opened up with rapid shots. Sarah flattened herself behind the crates as bullets sparked off metal and sent concrete chips flying. "Dad, go!" the younger man shouted. "I'll handle this." But Vincent Kellerman's voice came from much closer than Sarah expected. "No, son. Some things a man has to finish himself." She looked up to find the elderly lawyer standing 10 feet away, pointing an antique revolver, probably from the same era as his crime, directly at her chest. His hands were steady despite his age, and his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who'd already killed to protect his secret. 47 years, he repeated quietly. "But I suppose all good things must end." The sound of sirens began wailing in the distance, growing louder with each second. Morrison's backup call had gone through. Vincent Kellerman smiled sadly and adjusted his grip on the gun. The morning sun cast long shadows across the farmhouse porch where Sarah sat with her coffee, watching the last of the FBI evidence trucks pull away down the gravel drive. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus Chen's arrest, and the property finally felt quiet again. The hidden garage beneath the barn had been sealed pending the completion of the federal investigation, but the weight of 47 years of secrets no longer pressed down on the old farm. Detective Rivera's car appeared at the end of the lane, dust trailing behind it like a golden ribbon. Sarah had been expecting this visit. There were still loose ends to tie up, final statements to give. She stood and walked to the railing as Rivera climbed the porch steps, his usually serious expression softened by something that might have been relief. "Mrs. Chen," he said, removing his hat, "I hope you don't mind the intrusion. I wanted to update you on a few things before the case officially closes. Please sit." Sarah gestured to the wooden chair beside hers. "I've been wondering about Marcus, how he's doing." Rivera settled into the chair with a slight grimace. The past month had aged him visibly. "He's talking now, started 3 days after his arrest and hasn't stopped since. 47 years of guilt will do that to a person." Through the kitchen window, Sarah could see Tom moving around, probably making his 3rd pot of coffee of the day. The routine of normal life was slowly returning, but she knew neither of them would ever quite shake the knowledge of what had been hidden beneath their feet all these years. "The Caldwell Museum has confirmed the authenticity of all 23 vehicles," Rivera continued. "The total value, adjusted for appreciation and rarity, comes to just over $42 million. The insurance company is beside themselves. They've been paying out smaller claims for decades on pieces they thought were lost forever." Sarah nodded slowly. "And the people who were hurt during the original heist?" Marcus led us to detailed records he'd kept, names, addresses, what happened to each family affected. Turns out he'd been anonymously sending money to some of them for years, trying to make amends without revealing himself. Rivera paused, studying the distant tree line. "The man's been carrying this weight for most of his life. Part of me almost feels sorry for him." "Almost," Sarah repeated softly. "He killed 2 people, Mrs. Chen. Whatever guilt he felt afterward doesn't change that." Rivera's voice hardened slightly. "The families of those security guards deserve justice, even if it comes nearly 5 decades late." A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals above the barn. Sarah watched it for a moment before speaking. "What I still don't understand is why he came back. After all those years of successfully hiding, why risk exposure by returning to the farm?" Rivera shifted in his chair. According to his statement, he never intended to. He'd been living quietly in Oregon under an assumed identity, working as a mechanic. But when he learned about the planned demolition through old property records, he panicked. He thought he could retrieve just a few of the most valuable pieces before the site was disturbed. Instead, he walked into chaos. "Exactly. By the time he arrived, your demo crew had already found the garage. His carefully constructed life started unraveling, and he made increasingly desperate choices to try to contain the damage. Tom appeared in the doorway with a fresh mug of coffee, offering it to Rivera before settling on the porch swing. His presence brought a comforting normalcy to the conversation, grounding Sarah in the present rather than the maze of the past. "The demolition crew," Tom asked quietly, "how are they handling all this?" "Better than expected," Rivera replied. "Jake Morrison's been struggling some. Finding out he nearly died because of a 47-year-old secret has been hard to process, but they're all cooperating fully with the investigation. Good people caught up in something they never could have imagined." A comfortable silence settled over the porch. Sarah found herself thinking about all the mornings she and Tom had sat here, drinking coffee and planning their simple days, never knowing that millions of dollars in stolen artifacts lay hidden beneath their barn. It seemed almost absurd now. "There is one more thing," Rivera said, reaching into his jacket pocket. He withdrew a small wooden box, worn smooth by age. "Marcus asked me to give this to you. Said it belonged to the original owners of the farm, the couple he bought it from back in 1976. Sarah took the box with trembling fingers. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a simple gold locket. When she opened it, two faces looked back at her, a young couple from another era, their eyes bright with hope and possibility. "He said they were good people who deserved better than to have their home turned into a hiding place for stolen goods," Rivera added quietly. As the detective's car disappeared down the lane, Sarah held the locket up to catch the afternoon light. Sometimes, she thought, the most important treasures aren't the ones worth millions. Sometimes they're simply the memories of good people living honest lives.